I'd like to kickstart this dialogue, first of all, with a question for President Ruto. Just last week, you took America by storm. You were the talk of the town for a considerable amount of time in Atlanta and in Washington, D.C., the first African leader to go on a state visit to Washington, D.C. in 50 years. From all indications, a very, very successful mission, and we say congratulations to you and to Kenya. Now, for quite a while, you've been a very vocal advocate for reforming the global financial architecture, and we've heard much from you today. You've pretty much given us a tour de force of what Africa needs and what Africa needs to do. Now, considering that change is usually slow and not as quick as we anticipate it or want it to be, in terms of priorities in the short term, what do you think Africa should focus on, and what should be the major priorities moving forward?
Thank you very much. And again, let me take this opportunity to welcome all of us to Nairobi and Kenya. It is said that half the solution to a problem is identifying that there exists a problem. For a very long time, many people did not admit that there was something fundamentally wrong with the international financial architecture. In fact, initially, when voices were raised, they were dismissed. But I want to say today we are very proud, those of us, especially from this continent, who raised our voices, that today the conversation in the world is no longer whether we have a fit-for-purpose international financial architecture. Everybody admits that there is something fundamentally wrong with it. The issue in conversation now is where, how do we reform it? So the issue of reform is settled. It must be done. And I think it begins with, once we understand the problem, then it begins with where do we start? I think what we are saying is we need a financial architecture that has the following characteristics. Number one, long-term financing. 40 years, grace period, 10 years, or something in that order. Number two, low interest rates, concessional financing, including, where possible, grants. Number three, we also need financing at scale. The quantum is very important. And then number four, we also need financing that is agile, that is flexible, especially that responds, that is climate sensitive, so that if there are shocks, that financial architecture must be responsive, because climate change is the new normal. Switching from drought to floods progressively is becoming what it is. In Kenya, we had drought a year ago that decimated 2.5 million heads of livestock. This year, we're in floods that has taken the lives of 200 Kenyans. So this is the new reality. So the financial architecture that must be in place must respond to this climate reality that we have. And finally, is to be sensitive to sustainability. So our priority is to sort out the financial architecture. That's number one. Number two, our priority is to make sure that this continent, with its tremendous potential, we move it from potential to opportunity, from opportunity to investment. And finally, as I have said, even as we try to do something outside, we must also do something inside. That is why we are also looking at our own systems, our own governance, our own instruments. And that's why we are discussing, even internally, reform of the Africa Union, so that we are aligned as we reform the international financial architecture, as we reform the investment space to create opportunity for our assets. We must also reform our own institutions so that we align them and repurpose them to be in line with our aspirations and the outcomes we are looking for.
Thank you very much, President Ruto. In other words, reform is a two-way street. It's not just one way. But allow me to follow up very quickly. As we all know, Kenya and a number of other countries have been buffeted very devastatingly by extreme weather conditions, unpredictable weather conditions. And I think the projections for Kenya and other countries in the region are that over the next 7 years, we're still likely to see the same kind of weather patterns that we've seen this year. That being the case, and again, following a two-way reform process, what is it that African countries should be doing right now to mitigate the effects of climate change?
It is true that predictions are that Kenya and our region is going to have above normal rains for the next 7 years. That's a prediction. It is both positive and negative. And that is why, working with institutions like the Africa Development Bank, we are developing resilience instruments. It is the reason why we are having a conversation with the Africa Development Bank on our water infrastructure. How do we take care of this excess water? And how do we turn this excess water into an asset for making sure that we use it for our food security, we use it for the positive elements. So we must align our programs, our strategies with the reality of the moment and with the predicted reality of the future. So that is the alignment that we must do.
Thank you very much, President Ruto. I'm going to come to President Kagame next on a number of issues, particularly with regards to the global financial architecture, as well as the issue of reforms. Both yourself and President Ruto have been aligned. That being the case, what reforms do you really think should pave the way for giving Africa the resources that it needs to finance its own transformation and inclusive growth, even in the face of devastating climate change? What are the most critical reforms that you see and anticipate are needed?
Thank you. Let me quickly, first of all, and more importantly, thank our hosts, President Ruto, His Excellency, and also the President of the Africa Development Bank Group for inviting us here. Now, quickly to the point, we are talking about the architecture, well, international financial architecture. Therefore, in mind, we have the architects. So what did the architect have in mind when they provided us with the architecture we have to deal with? They must have had their own interests. They must have framed things the way they wanted to benefit themselves, or maybe we can assume that they wanted to benefit the whole world. Now, we are here discussing the situation as it is, where we find there are enormous resources in this world, but inequitably distributed. So Africa has to look at itself and look at the whole world as it's set up. And we know in this world, people, countries work for interests, their own interests. Africa's interests and the countries of our continent interests must be taken care of, beginning with ourselves. So, and we talk about speaking with one voice many times. It has to be one voice. It has also to be loud and clear and effective. For that to happen, we think about working together. We think about representation. And representation is not also just numbers. It's being able to speak out loudly and representing ourselves rather than having other people represent us. So it starts from what has been talked about, that is very important, when it was in the speech of His Excellency President Ruto and His Excellency Musa Faki. Therefore, the reforms we are talking about is how do we disrupt, if you will, the current architecture as we have it, so that it includes significantly and visibly the interests of our continent. Our continent, whether it is human resources or natural resources or any resources we are thinking about, how can anyone interested in the well-being of the people of this world sideline our continent? In actual fact, if you look at the facts as they are, in a few decades, the only place in this world that will be having a growing middle class is Africa, the only one. So it is even in the interests of the rest of the world that has marginalized Africa to contribute to the well-being of our continent, because the growth of Africa, based on this middle class, feeds into the growth of the rest of the world. So they should even be accepting some of these proposals in self-interest, because Africa grows, the whole world grows. But Africa cannot wait to be handed this opportunity by anybody else. We therefore must be on the front line, really fighting for this right, and therefore for ourselves, but also which contributes to the well-being of the rest of the world.
President Kagame, I want to be a little bit provocative here. I've been coming to Kenya for probably 30 years. And there are places that I used to know that I no longer recognize. Why? Because the city's architects have changed the landscape. Now, most of the Bretton Woods institutions were created 60 to 80 years ago at a different time from the one that we live in. So, if we're going to talk about reform, it's not just the access to resources. It's looking at those institutions that were created back then and asking the question, are they still relevant to the needs of today? What is your thought about redesigning a lot of these institutions to make them fit for purpose?
Well, absolutely. It's a no-brainer that what worked 50 years ago or designed 50 years ago, things have changed, and therefore a rethink of a new design that fits the purpose must be into play. There's no question about it. But here what we are talking about is not simply an argument of whether, this is fit for purpose or this. I think everybody understands that point. But there are philosophies, if you will, or interests or that operate behind that. For us in Africa, we are hard pressed to see that there is a change of these and in the design of these institutions. But maybe the way the institutions are set up, benefiting some parts of the world, those in those parts of the world are not interested in having the change happen because it gives them control, it gives them say over other people's resources even. So it's not that people don't understand. Especially for Africa, we understand it better because of how we are affected. But the other parts of the world that have the power and control, it's also not because they don't understand, but it is because that it serves them very well, benefits them, that they are not interested or they are slow in allowing change to happen. So it's not a very complicated thing to understand. Everybody understands that. What is complicated is to reach this understanding and compromise that we don't lose anything by having everybody benefit as we should benefit all of us. That's where the issue lies. And therefore, the reforms are based on this thinking. We are only looking for the pathways to having the reforms implemented that provide us with less costs than having to fight so much over what is obvious that actually benefits all of us, as I said.
Thank you very much, President Kagame. I'm going to come next to President Al-Menfi. Let me bring it closer home. Obviously, your country has had quite a number of challenges economically in recent times. What areas do you think that the African Development Bank can support Libya in the best to help you reach that last mile of reaching economic transformation in your country?
From the outset, I would like to extend a very warm thanks to President William Ruto, as well as the people of Kenya, for the very warm welcome extended to us. I'd like to thank Mr. President as well for his leadership role in this transformation, the financial transformation, economic transformation, also the transformation of financial institutions across Africa. I'd also like to stress another point, that is to say that sometimes in some African countries, there is a need for technical expertise rather than financing. This is what we could refer to as twinning, let's say, or finding the right balance and combining complementarity between financing and technical expertise. So all financial institutions, in fact, that we know were established at a time when African countries were subject to occupation, and therefore these are institutions that do not serve Africa. And yet today Africa has developed, Africa has many resources and assets, and Africa is very much in a position to grow and to develop at a much faster pace than at any time before. And we would like to, in this connection, to underscore the role played by Libya in various periods of time in African countries. Libya, at present, is very much in a position to continue to invest in African countries. Of course, there are some financial arrangements and guarantees that need to be set out, but between us as African countries. But of course, Libya, based on its political stability, will be able to also lend its support to financial institutions, particularly as we are discussing three important financial institutions currently. The African Development Bank, as well as the African Investment Bank, which is currently headquartered in Tripoli. We are currently finalizing some of the implementation arrangements for its full launch. And we hope that this institution will really play a pivotal role and be an additional step in terms of strengthening African financial institutions. We're interested as well in cooperation between countries, but also with the African Union, promoting imports and exports within Libya. We've heard Mr. President address this, promoting trade with Europe and Asia as well, but we need to have intra-African trade as well. Libya is in need of African cooperation because Libya has always looked to Africa. Libya is very vested in developing within Libya. Libya draws its strength from Africa and vice versa. So therefore, when our investments are made in the south, particularly as we have plans, particularly, for instance, roads extending to Niger, to Central Africa, we have a number of railway projects as well as others aimed at connecting Northern Africa to Southern Africa. Leveraging our oil-based resources and the stability of these resources, we would like to provide solutions and reforms to the needs that we have in Africa and in Libya. And of course, we very much look to contributing and working with the presidents. Thank you.
Prime Minister, very much, President Al-Menfi, greatly appreciated capacity building, cooperation, and consulting on a regional basis. I'm going to come next to Prime Minister Sarah Kugangelwa Amadila. Kindly forgive me. I know that my pronunciation is not too correct, but please forgive me here. I'm very, very particular about pronouncing names properly. Now, your country, Namibia, was one of the first to attain upper middle income status in Africa. A great accomplishment. What are some of the lessons that the rest of Africa can take away from Namibia in this regard?
In spite, I must say, of the fact that we have managed to record positive economic growth almost every year since independence, except in a few years when we were faced with emergencies like COVID, droughts, and floods, and we are very prone to these disasters. We, however, still face challenges of inequities. The bulk of the population, who are the indigenous communities, are living in poverty, and much of the wealth is owned by Namibians of European extraction. So that is one of the serious challenges that we have to address. The second challenge is the fact that because we are a commodity-based economy for the most part, the growth in GDP did not necessarily translate in proportional growth in employment and poverty reduction. So although we have reduced poverty, we still have significant number of people that are poor, and also many of our young people are still struggling to find employment. So we consider it a priority to diversify the economy, to promote value addition, so that we can create jobs and also reduce the vulnerability of the economy to external shocks, including the shocks to droughts and floods. And actually, as we speak now, Namibia is one of the worst droughts that we have faced. About 1 million people are depending on government support to be to survive, because the harvest was very poor, the rains were late and grossly inadequate. So we do have those challenges, and we are also prioritizing, because we are a small population, we are only 3 million, and we are vast in terms of infrastructure. It's very costly to put them up. We are prioritizing integration with the rest of the continent, so that we are not limited in what we produce by our small population.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Madila. Very much appreciated. I'm going to come next to His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat. Now, in your position as AU chairperson, you have a front row seat on what's going on in different parts of the continent. What's your assessment of the progress that we're making in terms of structural reforms on the continent? Are we on track, or is there much more that we need to do?
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais rappeler qu'il y a 4 jours, nous avons célébré le 61e anniversaire de l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine, qui est devenue en 2002 l'Union africaine. La BAD également a 60 ans. La BAD est l'une des institutions qui a été expressément chargée par l'Union africaine à mobiliser des ressources pour la mise en œuvre de l'agenda 2063 que nous nous sommes donnés au 50e anniversaire de notre organisation. Il y a 8 ans, en juillet 2016, à Kigali, la conférence des chefs d'État a évalué la situation du continent
and decided to undertake institutional financial reforms in the African Union. This was a task that was put expressly to Paul Kagame, who did an excellent job. And we heard about this at the last summit. We can't think only about the international arena. We, within the continent, need to undertake reforms. We have a very ambitious agenda, Agenda 2063. And we first must undertake reforms in our own institutions so as to be able to speak in unison. We know that we have resources in Africa, human resources, 1.4 billion inhabitants, 3 million square kilometers, numerous.
Innombrables, mais malgré tout ça, nous n'avons pas pu réaliser les attentes des populations africaines. Donc, la première des choses, c'est une réforme endogène au sein du continent pour nous donner les meilleurs moyens pour pouvoir discuter sur l'arène internationale. Cette réforme est en cours, des progrès importants ont été réalisés, mais il n'en demeure pas moins.
Natural resources, and we have yet to live up to the expectations of African populations. So the first thing we need is endogenous reform within the continent so that we have the wherewithal to be able to then discuss these matters on the international arena. This reform is underway. There's been significant progress. We still have things to do. This has to be said honestly. We still often think only about sovereignties linked to states. We need to be more united, more integrated. That's what Agenda 2063 wants, a prosperous, integrated Africa. In terms of the international arena, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, all of these, of course, arose after the Second World War. The winners set up these institutions, And all of these years later, it is painfully obvious that these institutions now face different challenges. The demographics have changed, politics has changed, financial markets have changed. We need to reform our institutions. Africa was guinea pig in terms of the different approaches and structural programs. How are we going to reduce poverty? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? All these different policies that were undertaken. Today, we have priorities, we have clearly defined planning, and we're talking to the international community, not asking for charity. We're asking to be taken on an equal footing, asking to be accepted as having a voice. We need to be able to develop. I think there's important work to be done. I think that partners, those who are in the lead, need to understand that this is a world where we need to stand united, and in order for that to be possible, Africa needs to be looked upon in a different light. We ourselves need to improve our governance, whether this be political, institutional, economic, financial. But we need the international community, if we want a world full of stability, we need the international community to revisit rules that were set up over 80 years ago and no longer correspond to the reality on the ground. This is what we need.
Very much, Your Excellency. And I'm going to go just from the point you just made right now over to President Kagame. Now, no one is in any doubt that reshaping and reforming the global financial architecture is going to be a walk in the park. It's going to have its own challenges. And it would seem that doing so, the reforms that we need are going to be both short-term and long-term. This being the case, what must Africa do to ensure that it strengthens its voice and it is able to engage in ongoing conversations on reforming the global financial architecture? What is it that we need to do on a consistent basis? So this isn't just a one-off conversation. What are the things that we need to do in the global space?
We must walk the talk, because we have discussed these issues for many years, as I can remember, and we are saying the right things. So we must start doing the right things that we know how. One is being together. We must, as I said, the unit of our continent through the African Union and other institutions, including this bank that invited us here, the African Development Bank. It's all about Africa. First of all, we must have it in our mind. And therefore, there is a need for mindset change from the past to the present. And we cannot be served well in our intentions for the future if we are not thinking correctly, acting correctly right now. So when we have been talking about the African Union reforms, as His Excellency President Ruto, my brother, mentioned earlier, you know, before I handed over to the president, I had been carrying out these tasks. I mean, there is no secret here. I just say it as it is. We agreed many things. Most of the countries were represented in the room, heads of state and government. We have agreed many things that need to be done because it is right and it is the only thing that can deliver what we want. Few years later, 2 years maybe from the time we decided, we have discussions in Addis at the African Union headquarters. you find some of the, 50% of the things we agreed have changed. And you're asking the same leaders in the room, you say, what happened? What we are saying now that we must be doing is what we agreed 2 years ago. Why have we not done exactly what we agreed? And nobody gives an answer. So we cannot escape this. We cannot escape doing the very things we have agreed to do because we know that is what is going to deliver what we want for our continent. There is no other way I can put it. There is no magic wand that is in anybody's hand to bring the change that we want. So when we are here discussing and everybody is listening, and we are listening to ourselves, we must get out of this room with a commitment, a conviction that we can actually deliver what the continent wants, and we are the ones to do that. The rest will continue to be discussions back and forth, speeches back and forth, but we will not get the results. But some progress has been made. It is a slow progress. Even then we are saying we can't afford to move slowly. It's urgent.
I just want to quickly touch base with Your Excellency Musa Faki. With regards to the global financial architecture, how do you see that dovetailing into the ambitions of Agenda 2063?
You see, let me start by thanking Presidents Kagame and Ruto, who are leading this significant reform within the African Union. It goes without saying that if we do not close ranks, we cannot really succeed in terms of the reforms of the international financial institutions. This is obvious. So the more we work and close ranks so as to have a common African position, then the better for us to hope to cause a change in the rules. Today, there is an image which is not really the real image of the continent. We are considered as a risky continent with extremely high rates. President Ruto mentioned this. He talked about figures which are 10 or 9-fold what rates apply elsewhere. So in order to finance the 2063 agenda, especially the flagship projects which NEPAD is working on, together with the African Development Bank and other institutions, including the African Union Commission, we need financing, which financing cannot be mobilized solely within the continent of Africa. Now, rules governing investment and other aspects have to be revised so that the continent of Africa, just like other continents worldwide, can actually invest in the international markets. The efforts are already afoot within the continent, but the international system should also play along so that in a fair and equitable fashion, you give the opportunity to the continent of Africa to develop. We cannot just content ourselves with being a reservoir of commodities and raw materials and a field of battle, of geological battle. And this is the unfortunate situation. We've been the theater of all kinds of struggles, and there's a risk that will continue to be the battleground for those major economic powers. So we need to close ranks, work in unison so that we can speak with one voice and be a strong negotiation voice and strength with the other partners. Because one of the most important aspects of this agenda is partnership. We cannot really be thinking about developing in silos. So as part of partnership, we have to speak with one voice. Alas, so far, we do not really have this uniting force which can speak with one voice so as to cause a change in the order of things. This, therefore, is a challenge, not only on us, for us, but also with our relations with the international community, especially the international financial system.
Excellency, I'm just going to provide each one of our panelists with a closing comment as we bring this session to a close, keeping in mind, again, the theme of this conversation, Africa's transformation agenda. But I'd like you to focus in on what the African Development Bank can still do to help achieve the agenda.
I would say first we applaud the ADB for the work that it has done in terms of mobilizing funding and the good governance that is prevailing at the institution that inspires the trust of the partners to work with the bank to raise funds to support development in Africa. The first point that I would like to raise is one that relates to funding for middle-income countries, drawing from the experience of Namibia. This is a challenge that we face everywhere, including at the ADB. Because of the higher per capita income, in spite of the inequities that I have referred to, the high unemployment and high levels of poverty, we get funding that is quite pricey, making it difficult for us to raise the adequate resources to fund development. Secondly, I would advise the bank, and I think it is amenable in that regard, as we do also advise other funders, to look at how their support can assist countries to develop their local capital markets. Because Namibia is one of those countries that have a relatively developed capital market, but not optimally developed, to be able to ensure intermediation. We actually export capital, whereas we borrow externally. So that is an aspect that is very important for us. Then there is the issue of funding to private sector, apart from funding government, without the requirement of government to provide a collateral, and partnering with private financial institutions so that their capacity that is here is also shared with African financial institutions to be able to support development in those countries. And obviously, we would like funding to really prioritize growth-enhancing measures, measures that support economic growth, that support diversification and value adding. We are mineral resources endowed as a continent, but because mining itself is not job intensive, we need to develop the full value chain of our mineral resources. And we thank the bank for advocating for increased special drawing rights for African countries, and we would like it to also amplify the voice of middle-income countries so that we can raise more resources. There have been talks about also equity in terms of the harnessing of benefits from natural resources. This is something that is important for us as African countries, being the host of most of the resources. We want to share equitably in the benefits and supporting capacity to fight illicit flows of capital, so that we obviate the need for our countries to rely on external borrowings. Countries like Namibia could actually develop self-sufficiency in terms of funding if we can address illicit flows and we can optimize capital markets development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Amadiah. Very excellent points, and I'm sure Dr. Adishna is listening. Thank you very much for your input there. We're going to come next to President Kagame.
I will try to be very brief. I think very good points have been made by the Prime Minister of Namibia. But I want to thank the African Development Bank's president and his team, who have done a very good job of mobilizing resources for our continent and also leveraging those resources to broaden the investments as we need them on our continent. And I would only, with the support of everyone on our continent, we would urge him to even mobilize more resources, especially the private sector resources to be invested on our continent, because other sources are not enough in and of themselves. We have seen, for example, the time of COVID and towards the end, when the SDRs that were mobilized, we had 5% of that, of the 650 billion that was, so 5% of that for the whole continent of Africa is very small. So whichever sources we have, alone they are not enough. We need to diversify, therefore, the sources of the money that we need to invest on our continent. And I think that helps development of Africa to realize the agenda that is set for the 2063. And therefore, I thank all the leaders of our continent so that we continue to work together to support Africa Development Bank institution.
Thank you very much, President Kagame. And we'll go next to President Al-Menfi for your thoughts in this regard.
Thank you. I will also attempt to be brief. I would like to stress that the role played by the African Development Bank in Africa, and all of what we have heard, in fact, even in statements we've heard today, is of crucial importance. We're very much in support of the role played in this institution. And we hope to see also more cooperation between Libya and the African Development Bank as we move forward, for the sake of Libya's development and Africa's more broadly. I think it's important, of course, to focus on the issue of reforming financial institutions. I think that it's crucially important to have a unified African voice so that we can move towards establishing more African financial institutions. I referred earlier to the African Investment Bank, and in fact we call on countries which have not yet acceded to this institution to do so, because this will be a stepping stone in the construction of a stronger Africa. It will also be an opportunity for us to implement the decisions and resolutions of the AU, which are a unified position. Thank you.
President, and last, well, not last actually, because we're going to come to President Ruto later on, I'm going to ask the AU Chair, Musa Faki, for your thoughts in this regard.
Let me congratulate AfDB and his team, and particularly my brother, Dr. Adesina. They did very well, and they're doing very well. I hope they will act in the future in complementarity and also in coordination with other partners in the continent. Because we have also a partnership with China, with India, with Arab countries through the Islamic Development Bank. And I think this coordination and this complementarity will allow us to implement our agenda, the 2063 Agenda, African Agenda.
We're going to give the last word at this point to our host, President William Samoei Ruto. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me thank fellow panelists here for all the very positive and informative comments they have made about this very important subject. Let me pick up from where President Kagame left. He told us, let's begin by believing in ourselves. I think it's a very important issue that we must believe in ourselves first. And we must stop outsourcing problems we have created or outsourcing solutions we can provide for ourselves. There are things we can do to sort out some of the challenges we are facing. And in the context of Africa Development Bank, we all admit that Africa Development Bank has demonstrated understanding of our financial needs, and they have developed innovative instruments to work on food security, infrastructure, water development, youth entrepreneurship, women. They have demonstrated. What ADB wants or needs from us is to us to believe in them the way they believe in us. Provide support for ADB, and that is why we are voicing our support for replenishment of ADF, $25 billion. We are enhancing our own support through enhancing our shareholding in Africa Development Bank. We must support these institutions. Africa Development Bank here, AfriExim, Trade Development Bank, all the other financial institutions in our continent. We must give them the stamp of approval as leaders in this continent and support them. That way, they can support us. Secondly, we must believe in ourselves. You know, President Kagame warned me when he handed over the baton of this reform to me that this job is not very easy. And that you have heard him say we need to move fast. Luckily, I come from a country of athletes. So running fast will not be a problem. My only worry is that we should not leave anybody behind so that we can move together. And hopefully, we are all listening as leaders here that we need to believe in ourselves. Whatever, we must walk the talk. We must believe in ourselves. We must do this because it is necessary for us. We can never go wrong by doing the right thing. And finally, let me ask ADB, looking into the future, to give them two assignments. We need to write a new narrative for Africa. We have been profiled negatively for far too long. Please, if you can support an Africa credit rating agency that will be factual about the situation in Africa. Let me give you an example. We went to the market as Kenya. And then there was a situation in Niger. And we were told, you are going to pay 2 points more because there was a situation in Niger. Niger is very far from Kenya, you know. But somewhere, somebody sitting in Washington or some other place thinks Niger is in Nairobi, you know. So please, if you can work on an Africa credit agency that will help put factual information into the financial architecture so that this unnecessary risk profiling is reduced. Let me ask you for one more thing, which you believe in Mr. Adesina, before you leave office next year, before you move on to another assignment, you have talked about undervaluation of our GDP as a continent. That in the calculation of our GDP, the huge resources, mineral resources that we have are not factored. The huge energy resources, renewable energy resources are not factored. The huge resources we have, having 60% of Africa's, or the world's actually, remaining uncultivated arable land is not factored. Our provision of natural carbon sinks is not factored in our GDP. And that is why most of the time we are told our debt is not sustainable, because our own GDP is not correctly evaluated. Please, if you can work with us to get the true valuation of our GDP so that we can drive Africa's development in a positive manner. I don't think those are too many assignments, Adesina. I am I'm very optimistic that these are assignments you can undertake on all our behalf as we drive the continent's prosperity into the future. And thank you very much.
Excellent closing thoughts. I want to say a very big thank you to all of our presidential delegates, our panelists during this session for your excellent thoughts. You've given us much food for thought. Again, we thank you, President Ruto, President Kagame, President Al-Menfi, Prime Minister Kugon Gelwa Amadia, and AU Commission Chair Musa Faki. Thank you for enriching our conversation this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, could you kindly give our distinguished presidential panelists a warm round of applause and thank them for their leadership of our continent.